David Miller was a beloved schoolteacher. By sunrise, he was dead in his own living room. Detective Sarah Collins was the first on the scene, and within minutes, she realized this wasn't just another crime. It was a carefully staged nightmare with a hidden message. With only 24 hours before the killer struck again, every clue, every second, would decide who lived and who died. Welcome to Narrated Mysteries, uncovering lies, betrayal, and the chilling stories people tried to bury. The morning began like any other in the quiet town, but everything shifted when the police received a call that shattered the calm. David Miller, a respected schoolteacher known for his kindness and dedication, had been found dead inside his home. Officers rushed to the address, expecting perhaps a burglary gone wrong or some accident. Instead, they stepped into a scene that felt almost unreal. The air inside the house was heavy and still, as if the walls themselves were holding a secret too dark to release. David's lifeless body lay sprawled across the living room floor, and nothing about the position looked natural. It wasn't random violence. It was deliberate, methodical. The strangest detail wasn't just the body, but the way the crime scene was arranged. Furniture was tipped over as though there had been a struggle, yet fragile items like a vase of fresh flowers sat perfectly upright, untouched. It was as if the killer wanted the investigators to notice the contradictions, to sense the design in the chaos. On the wall above David's body, smeared in what appeared to be his own blood, was a chilling mark. It wasn't a word, not a clear picture, but a pattern, a symbol carefully drawn as if to leave a signature behind. For the officers standing there, the silence of the room was broken only by the ticking of a clock. The crime felt personal and yet theatrical, like someone had staged it for an audience. Word spread quickly through the station, and within minutes the chief knew they were not dealing with an ordinary case. Somewhere in the eerie quiet of that house, hidden in the details, was a message that would set the tone for everything to come. Detectives moved carefully through the house, studying every corner of the room where David Miller had been found. The scene was unsettling not because of its chaos, but because of its precision. The living room looked disturbed at first glance, but the more they studied it, the clearer it became that nothing was random. A coffee table had been overturned, yet none of the items on top were broken. A bookshelf leaned against the wall, but every book was still in neat rows, untouched. The entire space gave the impression of violence without any real destruction, as if someone had staged a performance for the police to witness. The most disturbing element remained the symbol drawn in blood above David's body. It wasn't a careless smear or the mark of desperation. It was deliberate, even symmetrical, almost like the killer had practiced it before. Investigators photographed it from every angle, trying to decipher its meaning. Was it a warning, a signature, or simply a taunt? Whatever the intention, it was the kind of detail that forced everyone in the room to acknowledge that the killer wanted them to see it. Other strange details deepened the mystery. David's watch had been removed and placed neatly on the mantel, still ticking, perfectly in time. A glass of water sat on the kitchen counter, half full but untouched. The house was locked from the inside, with no signs of forced entry. Whoever had entered the home either had a key or was trusted enough to be let in. The realization settled heavily among the team. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity. It was someone who knew David, someone who had taken the time to craft a message that went far beyond murder. The investigation had barely begun when the weight of time pressed down on everyone involved. The discovery of the symbol in blood convinced the police chief this case was more than a single killing. The careful staging, the strange details, the eerie precision, all pointed to a mind that was sending a message, not just taking a life. The chief gathered the team and made it clear they had only one day to stop whatever was coming next. The thought of another victim was no longer speculation. It was an expectation. Detectives knew that every hour lost could mean another life. Evidence had to be processed faster than usual. Interviews had to be conducted without pause, and every officer was reassigned to focus solely on this case. The pressure was relentless. The crime scene unit rushed to test fingerprints, hair strands, and fibers. Digital forensics began digging into David Miller's devices before the blood on the walls had even dried. Each team worked in silence, with the sense that the killer might already be preparing to strike again. The clock on the wall of the precinct seemed louder than ever, each tick counting down toward a deadline none of them could fully predict. If the killer had a pattern or a plan, they needed to uncover it before he acted again. What unsettled the detectives most was the idea that the symbol might have been a clue, not just a signature. If so, it was designed to be read quickly, as if the killer was daring them to race against him. The urgency transformed the case into something far greater than a hunt for justice. It became a desperate battle against time itself, where one mistake or one delay could cost another innocent life. Detectives spread out through the neighborhood, moving door to door in search of anything unusual. In small towns, people noticed details that seemed meaningless at first, and every sliver of information mattered. Some neighbors recalled hearing faint music drifting through the night, though no one could say exactly where it came from. The melody was soft, almost haunting, the kind of tune that sticks in the back of the mind long after it fades. Others mentioned spotting a car parked on the street in the early hours, one they didn't recognize. It was described as dark, possibly blue or black, with tinted windows that gave away nothing about who sat inside. One elderly woman swore she had seen David in a heated argument with a younger man a few days before his death. She couldn't remember the man's face clearly, only that his gestures were sharp and aggressive, and David seemed deeply unsettled by the exchange. Another neighbor said they thought they saw shadows moving in David's yard the night before the body was discovered, but assumed it was nothing more than animals. Every account gave a fragment of the bigger picture, but the fragments didn't quite fit together. The detectives pieced the stories onto a timeline, trying to determine what was noise and what was real. The strange car, the music, the argument, none of it directly tied to the crime, yet it painted the sense of someone watching, planning, and waiting. The house didn't feel like the only stage anymore. It felt as if the entire neighborhood had been part of the performance, with the killer moving silently among them. The more they listened, the more detectives realized this wasn't random chaos. Someone had been circling David's life, weaving themselves into the background until the moment they struck. The search of David Miller's house moved beyond the living room and into the spaces where he lived his private life. Detectives combed through his study, a small room lined with books and papers stacked neatly on the desk. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but one officer noticed a drawer that wouldn't open. It was locked, secured in a way that suggested David had wanted its contents hidden. With permission from the chief, the drawer was forced open, and what lay inside shifted the case in a chilling direction. Stacked neatly in a bundle were letters, each one written on plain white paper, all delivered anonymously. The messages were short but sharp, carrying a tone of anger that grew worse with each letter. At first, they hinted at disappointment, then resentment, and finally, open threats. The handwriting was uneven, as if the writer wanted to disguise their identity, but what couldn't be hidden was the symbol at the bottom of every page. The same symbol smeared in blood on the wall now stared back from the paper, linking the crime scene directly to these warnings. Detectives spread the letters across the desk, examining the sequence. They spanned several months, proof that whoever killed David had been circling him for a long time. Each note sounded like a countdown, a steady build-up to something inevitable. The final letter, dated just a week earlier, read like a promise. Soon, everything ends. The meaning was now tragically clear. The discovery of the letters erased any thought of random violence. This was personal, calculated, and deeply rooted in David's life. Somewhere in his past, or his relationships, was the key to understanding the killer's obsession. And with the clock still ticking, the letters had become both a warning and a roadmap of the danger still ahead. The letters had already painted a disturbing picture, but David's phone and laptop revealed something far darker. Digital forensics worked quickly, pulling data that showed a trail of late-night messages from an unknown account. The messages weren't casual threats. They were written like riddles, each one layered with strange metaphors that seemed to taunt David rather than frighten him. Phrases like "the clock is ticking" and "you can't undo what you started" appeared again and again, leaving detectives with the chilling impression that the killer wanted a dialogue, a game only he controlled. The timestamps made the situation even more unsettling. The very last message was sent less than an hour before David's body was discovered. It wasn't a goodbye or a confession. It was a simple phrase, asterisk, "now we begin." Asterisk, the words struck the investigators like a hammer. They didn't mark an end, but a start, suggesting David's murder was only the opening move in something larger. The account behind the messages was hidden through layers of fake usernames and encrypted apps, designed to cover every digital footprint. Still, small glitches remained. Traces of an IP address hinted that the sender wasn't far from the town, maybe even within its borders. The killer wasn't taunting from a distance. He was close, possibly watching as detectives unraveled his work. Even more disturbing was David's reaction to the messages. He had saved them, but never reported them to police, as if he knew something about the sender. His silence suggested fear or guilt that had kept him from seeking help. That silence had cost him his life. For investigators, the trail confirmed what they dreaded. David wasn't chosen at random. He was part of a personal vendetta, one carefully executed with chilling patience. The investigation gained momentum when detectives uncovered a name that seemed to fit. A co-worker of David's had a history of bitter disputes with him, arguments that had spilled out into public view more than once. The man had openly criticized David at school meetings, accusing him of favoritism and dishonesty. To many, he seemed like someone who had both motive and anger enough to carry out such a crime. When neighbors mentioned seeing a car that matched his, suspicion deepened. The discovery of his fingerprints in David's kitchen made him the first real suspect. He was brought in quickly, and under the weight of questioning, the evidence initially appeared convincing. He admitted to being in David's home weeks before the murder, but denied stepping inside recently. Detectives pressed harder, hoping to crack his calm exterior, yet something didn't add up. He insisted that on the night of the killing, he was at work on an overnight shift, surrounded by colleagues who could confirm his presence. The alibi was checked, and to the frustration of the investigators, it held up. Time cards, surveillance footage, and multiple witnesses all confirmed he hadn't left his job that night. The certainty with which the evidence had pointed to him now unraveled, leaving behind only wasted hours and mounting pressure. The man who seemed like the perfect suspect was innocent. The realization shifted the investigation back to uncertainty, but it also carried a disturbing implication. If the killer had deliberately left fingerprints and planted details to steer detectives toward this co-worker, it meant the staging of the crime scene was even more elaborate than they thought. Someone wasn't just committing murder. They were weaving a trap, one that threatened to mislead the entire case and waste the precious time they couldn't afford to lose. Detectives returned to David Miller's home, determined to see what they had missed the first time. The false lead had cost them hours, and with the clock still running, they couldn't afford another mistake. They scrutinized every inch of the crime scene, focusing again on the blood symbol above the body. At first it had been dismissed as nothing more than a disturbing signature, but one officer noticed something strange about the lines. They weren't random shapes at all. They formed an outline that looked familiar. When the design was traced and compared to local maps, it revealed a rough layout of an industrial area on the edge of town. At the center of the shape sat an abandoned warehouse, long forgotten and rarely visited. The discovery electrified the team. It was no longer just a symbol. It was a map, a clue planted in plain sight. The decision to follow it came with risk. If the killer had left it intentionally, it could just as easily be a trap. But with time slipping away, detectives couldn't ignore it. The warehouse suddenly became the most critical lead in the case. The more they studied the symbol, the clearer the message became. The killer had wanted them to see it, had wanted them to make this connection. It wasn't only about finding the place. It was about proving they could keep up with his game. The thought unsettled the investigators. This wasn't just evidence. It was an invitation. Every officer felt the tension rise as plans were made to approach the warehouse. No one knew what they would find inside. It could be a dead end, or it could be the next step in a chain of horrors that hadn't yet reached its conclusion. The warehouse loomed at the edge of town, its windows shattered, its metal doors rusted shut. Detectives entered cautiously, flashlights cutting through the dust and darkness. At first, the place looked deserted, but deeper inside, the silence broke under the weight of something far more sinister. Against one wall stood a makeshift shrine. Photographs of David Miller were pinned in neat rows, some of them old, some taken only days before his death. Alongside the photos were scraps of paper covered in the same uneven handwriting found in the threatening letters. The air smelled of mildew and decay, but what froze the investigators was the personal belongings scattered across a small table. A watch, a wallet, and even a torn page from one of David's notebooks. It was clear the killer had been collecting pieces of his life, building an altar of obsession. But the horror didn't end there. Another section of the wall displayed a second set of photographs, faces of people still alive. Some were neighbors, others colleagues, all somehow linked to David. Each photo was marked with the same strange symbol, as though they too were targets waiting their turn. Detectives cataloged every item, piecing together the disturbing reality. David's death wasn't an isolated event. It was the opening act of something larger. The killer had mapped out future victims, and the warehouse was his hidden archive, a place where plans had been nurtured in silence. The discovery brought urgency crashing back. Whoever had created this shrine wasn't finished, and the next name on the wall could be hours away from becoming the next body. The warehouse had answered one question, but raised another. How much of the killer's plan had already been set in motion? Back at the lab, investigators worked tirelessly to process the evidence collected from the warehouse. Every photo, every note, every scrap of paper was examined, but it was a small, overlooked object that provided the break they had been waiting for. A glass jar, dusty and cracked, held a clear fingerprint. When it was run through the police database, the system flagged a match. The print belonged to a former student of David Miller, someone whose name had not come up until now. The suspect, Matthew Cross, had once been in David's class years earlier. Records showed he had been expelled after a violent outburst that left another student injured. After his expulsion, he disappeared from school records, moving between odd jobs and leaving behind a trail of minor arrests for disorderly conduct. His life had spiraled into isolation and bitterness. Teachers remembered him as withdrawn and unstable, and many believed he had carried a deep resentment toward David, whom he blamed for destroying his future. The more detectives dug, the clearer the connection became. Matthew had lived quietly in a rented trailer just outside town, avoiding attention. His internet history revealed hours spent searching for information about David, his co-workers, and even his neighbors. He had been watching, waiting, and collecting every detail of David's life until the obsession consumed him. The fingerprint tied him directly to the warehouse shrine, but the photographs of other potential victims made the situation more urgent. Matthew wasn't hiding his intentions anymore. He had built a plan fueled by revenge, and David was only the first name on his list. Now the task wasn't just to prove his guilt, it was to find him before another face on that wall became the next victim. The hunt for Matthew Cross turned into a frantic race against time. Detectives tracked his phone through fragments of data, pinging towers that showed him moving quickly across town. Each new location brought a wave of urgency, because it wasn't random. He was heading toward the home of another person whose photo had been pinned to the warehouse wall. The potential victim was a former colleague of David Miller, someone who had spoken against Matthew during the disciplinary hearings years ago. It was clear he was crossing names off a list of grudges. Patrol cars fanned out across the streets, sirens cutting through the evening air. Officers radioed updates every few minutes as they closed in on his path. The roads blurred into a chase against an invisible countdown, and every red light felt like a lost second. Detectives feared they would arrive too late, that the second victim would already be gone by the time they reached the address. When they finally spotted Matthew's car parked outside the house, their worst fears seemed confirmed. The door was ajar, and lights flickered from inside. Officers moved in with weapons drawn, their boots pounding against the porch. The silence inside the home was broken by the sound of movement, heavy footsteps echoing through the hall. What they found confirmed the danger. Matthew had already broken in and was armed, his next victim only feet away from him. The look on his face was one of rage, but also triumph, as though he had wanted them to follow him here. For a split second, it seemed like he might attack, but the officers moved faster. They swarmed, wrestling him to the ground, ending the pursuit just as another tragedy was about to unfold. The final moments of the case unfolded in a blur of tension and relief. Matthew Cross was dragged out of the house, restrained and furious, still shouting fragments of his twisted beliefs as officers secured him. Inside, the would-be victim sat trembling, alive only because the police had arrived in time. The scene drove home the reality that every second of the investigation had mattered. A delay of even a few minutes could have turned that rescue into another crime scene. Back at the precinct, detectives pieced together the full story of Matthew's descent. Years of resentment had grown into obsession, and that obsession had shaped into a calculated plan for revenge. David Miller's murder was never meant to be the end. It was the beginning of a series of attacks that would target anyone Matthew blamed for his failures. The warehouse shrine, the letters, the cryptic messages, all were part of his performance, designed to taunt the police and showcase his control. But his arrogance had also been his downfall. The fingerprint he left behind, the map hidden in the blood symbol, even the staged evidence meant to mislead investigators, all of it revealed a pattern that ultimately exposed him. The case had been solved in less than 24 hours, but those hours had been a battle against a cunning mind determined to outplay them. The town slowly returned to its routine, though the unease lingered. People spoke in hushed tones about the symbol, the shrine, and the narrow escape from more tragedy. For the detectives, it became a reminder of how fragile safety can be and how quickly ordinary lives can be shattered. The twisted case was closed, but the memory of its darkness would never fully leave the community or those who stopped it.